Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be talking all about saw set. I hope you enjoy. So what I want to do is bring you in here to the whiteboard and I'm going to explain what set is and what we need to look for and how it differs between a crosscut and a rip cut saw. It's quite important that you do notice the difference with a crosscut and a rip cut, and so we need to talk about it. What exactly is saw set? Well, I like to actually call it offset because you're essentially offsetting the saw teeth, as you can see here, and that is giving a clearance down here for the saw plate here to actually come through without binding up in the saw cut. So they sit out wider, and this is obviously a rip cut and a cross cut, and I'll explain what's going on there in a minute. And so if we came over here and we had no saw set and we tried to come through, we would end up binding up through here on the saw plate as we came through. It just couldn't make it through due to moisture content in the timber, movement in the wood and everything. It would just bind the saw up. And so that's why we cross hash the teeth, so kind of like this sort of thing. And so they alternate, one tooth goes one way, one tooth goes the other way, and that is what the set is. And what it's creating here in this gap, this is our kerf. That's what we call a kerf. It's what is left by the cutting tooth of the saw as it comes through, but the kerf is wider than the saw plate, purely so it doesn't bind up. Now, if you've got a more aggressive saw, your set is going to be more. If you've got a much finer saw with smaller teeth, your set can be less. For instance, if you have a big crosscut saw, say this one, I mean it's not got particularly big teeth, but you're going to have more set on something like this than a fine dovetail saw like this, because you don't need a lot of set on a dovetail saw because you're doing sort of shallow cuts, and so the thicker your cuts, cutting panels down and the like, you're going to need more set. But just as a rule of thumb, more teeth, less set, less teeth, more set. Okay, so we look here, this is our rip, this is our crosscut. Our rip cut, the set doesn't really matter which tooth goes which way, because they're a set of chisels, the teeth are identical, so it doesn't really affect it. If we look at a crosscut tooth, however, we have, or if we look at it from one side, we have bevel one side, no bevel, bevel, no bevel, bevel. And so what you want to be doing is pushing from the bevel side to push it out. So it's all the no bevels that are actually angled out. Because if you did it the other way, then your cutting line, the very tip here, would be offset by the bevel, and so you wouldn't be cutting right out in the furthest tip, and it wouldn't work as well, or I'm not even sure it would work at all. But that's why you want to make sure, and you can see here where I've depicted this, all the bevels are on the inside, and so we're pushing non-bevels out. If you look at the side of a cross-cut like this, which is a little difficult to actually depict here, it'll look like the bevel side is a slightly shorter tooth and the non-bevel is a slightly higher tooth, and that's just because they're bent towards you. So that is set in a nutshell. It is the offset of the tooth to stop the saw binding when you're sawing. Now, whether you're doing seasoned timber or green timber that's quite wet, just know that in dry timber you can get away with less set than in wet timber. It's just to do with the movement of the wood and how it binds up, and when you've got sap and stuff, and so you need more set in green wood to actually saw without it binding. Now there are other things that do come into play there, as I said, like sap and whatnot, but at its basic form we're dealing with seasoned wood mainly in our workshops, so we're going to be using a smaller amount of set. But just know that the set can vary based on the sawtooth pattern, how many teeth, and what you're actually sawing. Now, some people do adjust it between hardwoods and softwoods, but I just take a middle ground, and I've never really had a problem with it binding up, other than when you're doing panel cuts like in something like plywood. And if you're doing a long cut, it's not necessarily that you don't have enough set, but the wood can spring back behind it, and so sometimes you need to wedge your kerf open to stop it closing up behind the saw. So what I wanted to do first here is show you how to remove too much set. Now, the reason I want to show you how to remove too much set, and I have shown you this before, is that if you buy a brand new, say, Spear & Jackson like this one here, straight from the store, most times I've experienced is, and it's the case with every single one of these Spear & Jackson saws, they have too much set on the plate. So what I'm going to do is grab one of the panel saws that I've not done anything with. I'm going to show you how to remove the set first, and then I'm going to show you how to add the set. Now, to do this process, and we're going to be doing it on this saw here, you want 2 hammers. It doesn't have to be claw hammers. If you've got a claw hammer and a ball peen hammer, a lump hammer, something like that, a solid piece of metal to tap down onto, or like what I have here, a little anvil on the back of one of these vices, you can use that. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's jump down here to the vise, and we're going to use the double hammer method in this particular case. I'm going to come in and I'm going to bury my hammer in here until I can get it in a spot where I can actually clamp it in nice and solid. Sometimes the claw on these claw hammers can be a bit of a problem, but what you want to do is get this sitting as flat as you can. You want it sitting nice and horizontal and flat. Now, I'm going to use this hammer. The weight of the hammer, in my opinion, doesn't matter too much, but what we're going to be doing is this process here. So, you can start with whichever's more comfortable for you, and we just go like this. And other than making a pretty cool sound, what we're doing is actually tapping the tooth, and because they're made of high carbon spring steel, the idea is you tap them, it knocks it, and it kind of springs it back ever so slightly, removing the set. Now, you might need to do this process multiple times, and I recommend that you just keep testing how well the saw goes through the material, particularly if you're using like a fine tenon saw. You just want to keep testing that in a piece of wood to ensure that it feels right to you. Now, you could measure the set to say, oh, my set is slightly more than my saw plate with a set of calipers. I don't do that. I just go with what feels right, and if I need to pass it through again because it feels like it's still got too much set, that's what I do. Now, it's kind of arbitrary to determine that, but you kind of just get a feeling of the saw seems to not bind, but it also runs through quite easily, and it's just not taking a wider bite than it needs to, and the saw kind of just guides where you want it to go, and it follows where you want it to go. Now, there are other problems that can happen where your set goes off on one side or the other, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first of all, what I want to talk about is adding set to a saw. So, for adding set to a saw, we use something called a saw set. Now, vintage ones of these can be difficult to get. This happens to be a Somac number 250. I've used this one for a while. I do have another pistol grip one, but for the life of me, I've misplaced it and can't find it. So if we look at a saw set, it has an anvil. In this case, it's this round one that is actually tapered to adjust how much set is. And we have this little hammer that comes up that pinches. You can see the bit that moves up. It moves up and pinches. And then we have the little hammer, which is after it's pinched the saw, this little tiny bit down in here, which is a little bit hard to show. And that's what actually pushes into the saw plate and adds the set. This version, the more modern version, the vintage versions, the adjustments might be slightly different. It might not have this round one here, but it's got a piece that moves up and down with a taper on it. It doesn't really matter. These ones are a little easier to do because setting the amount of set is a little bit easier. Now, with these ones, the idea originally was that you'd pick the number versus the amount of teeth you've got, but I find that if I was to select 13 on here and put the set on this tenon saw here, that is 13 teeth per inch, it's going to overset the saw. And so I find around about 10 and 10 on these ones, and that's what I set for all my saws essentially, because they're all around from that 10 teeth per inch up to about 14, 15. I've found that the set of 10 works quite well. So let me get a saw over here in the vise and I'll show you how we go about doing this. With my small back saw here, I've just set it up really high. because you need access to come in over the top of the tooth like this. It's going to be hard for me to set these ones right at the very back here, but that's fine because generally you can't even saw with those, so it's sort of around this spot here because you're not really sawing back here, and that's where it gets down just as the handle curves away. But if you do saw here, you'd have to take the handle off on ones that you can. This particular one, you can take the screws out and take the handle off, and so you could do that with this particular one. If you've got one that doesn't, you'd just have to forego setting those ones there because it's unlikely you're going to be sawing back in this back little bit anyway. Generally, you're only going to start sawing from here, and so generally that's where I concentrate heavily on the set. Now, when we set these saws, what you want to do is look down on the top of your saw like this. You want to look down and you want to look at which way the teeth are bent. Now, once you've determined which way the teeth are bent, you want to make sure that that is the way you continue to bend that sawtooth. You don't want to push it back in the opposite direction to the other side because you can risk snapping it off. So you actually want to continue to push it in the direction it's already pushed in. I know that seems straightforward, but if you do push it in the other direction, you do risk snapping it, and you don't want to do that. So it's just a word of warning. Push it in the direction that you can already see it. Even if it's not much, keep it pushed in that direction. Now, I do recommend that if you're going to need to set your saw, and that could be every 5, 7, 10 sharpenings. It really depends if you've got an issue with your set that you need to reset it. Now, as you move further into the plate, obviously your set's only at the very tip, and so as you move further into the saw plate, you are going to need to add set to the saw. But, you know, it depends how often you sharpen as to when you're going to need to do it, and how many sharpenings you end up doing, and how far down into the saw plate you end up going. But no, you will have to do it, but it might not be any set amount of strokes. You'll just work out what it is for your saw, or if you feel like it's binding up, then you might have to set it. So the idea is, in my mind, set your saw, then sharpen it so you don't end up blunting the teeth that you've just sharpened, especially on a crosscut saw. There's more chance of blunting the very tip of the saw on those versus these chisel ones on a rib cut. So let me show you how this works, and there's no way to really make this easy. You could go through and mark every second tooth so you know which one you need to push if you've got trouble seeing it, but generally I just look at where the set already is on the saw and just go with it and add it. If you do miss a tooth here or there, it's probably not going to matter that much because it's only really a small amount. It's not the amount of set that you add with the saw set that stays there. Because it is sprung, it does spring back, so it becomes a little bit less than what you end up adding with your saw set. So what we have happen here, and I hope you can see this from above, so we have our anvil here, we have the bit that comes in and jams against it, it's almost part of the hammer, and then you have this little piece here, as I was trying to show you before, and that's what squeezes in and does the work. So I'm just going to come along to here because I've already done a few off camera just so I can get to an area that I can do this so you can see it easily. So we line it up like this. That tooth just there is the tooth that I'm doing. It's leaning in that direction because with these, this side is punching it out over that way. So you skip a tooth, go to the next, skip one, go to the next, skip one, go to the next, skip one. And so the process is I keep it against the anvil, line the hammer up, that grabs it, and you can see that I'm actually sitting it on the teeth right flat, these little wider pieces here, and that's to ensure that it's all sitting level, and then you squeeze it and you see the hammer goes forward. And we do that all the way along, and then what we do is we turn that saw plate around and we do the other teeth on the other side in the exact same process. Now I still set it above the top of the handle here, but it's not going to put the same amount of set on it because it's sitting a bit high and almost missing it. And you will notice here, I'm actually using this lamp here to add some extra light because you really want to be able to see over the top of your saw with this, and that extra light just makes it quite a bit easier actually. So as you can see there on this saw plate, which is only about, what is this one? This one's about 200mm long. It doesn't take long to actually do that kind of work to actually set your saw. I've just got a piece of pine here. These were kerfs that I've done once before in the other video, so let's just start this. Now, to me, that felt like it was absolutely perfect. There's no binding. It seems to be going quite freely. And that's what you're looking for. Is it binding? Is it going free? Now, what you're looking for when you're doing that test, although I'm not testing it, I'm just feeling that it feels right. The saw's running through smoothly. It feels like it's cutting quite nicely. But if you do look at the curve here, and it looks a little bit wider and a little ungainly, and it's a little bit hard to actually saw through, you might have slightly too much set, in which case go back to the double hammer method, give them a light tap, and then try again. If you feel like your saw plate is binding up and you've not got enough set, and that's how I settled on the 10 here, is from doing that. But if you feel like you haven't got enough, undo the screw on there, turn the little anvil bit here to increase the set it again, test again. So the other thing you can do when you're doing this is actually just run a couple of lines in here. And this is troubleshooting to ensure that you've got no issues with your set. Now, you'll come in, and if you can follow that line and saw dead straight on it, beautiful, no problem. Now, I don't have this problem with this, but say I'm coming down, and every time I do this, and we're going off on this angle every time. And so in this situation, if that was happening, you might somehow have got too much set on one side of the saw or the other. Now, I've only ever had this happen with one saw, and it wasn't to do with the set, it was to do with uneven teeth on my saw. It was a vintage one, and I was struggling to retooth it when I was first trying to retooth a saw, and the teeth were slightly larger on one side than the other, and that was causing this. So it can be the set. It could also be to do with uneven teeth. Now, if we're talking about brand new saws like this, I've never once had a problem with having too much set. But in the event that you do have it happen, and as I've said, I've never had it happen, there is a process that you can use, and that's called stoning the tooth or the side. And so what you want to do is, whichever side it's pulling to, that's the side that you've likely got too much set on. And so before I would even do this process, I would actually go back with my saw set and make sure that I've actually set them so I haven't accidentally underset one side versus the other, and then test it. If it's still doing it and it's still consistently pulling to that one side, you get your lightest, your thinnest diamond stone, whether it's one of these or a paddle style, or just a piece of sandpaper stuck, maybe 1200 grit sandpaper stuck to a piece of wood. And I'm not going to do this because there's nothing wrong with this, and you just run it lightly along one side with one pass. Then double check again. is it still pulling? If it's still pulling, lightly pass it again. And so you do one pass at a time, and what that'll do is actually remove the outside of the tooth, and it'll actually reduce the set slightly. But personally, if I've got that problem, I'm still going to try the double hammer method. I'm going to try every other method at my disposal before I go ahead and stone the side of the tooth, because I don't want to be stoning the side of the tooth. I have had it on a vintage one where I actually did that, and then I used the saw. It had larger teeth and it actually tore the top of the tooth off because it must have weakened it, or it could have had a weakness in the metal. But I think stoning the side of the teeth should always be a very last resort. There you have it, folks. That's all that I know and all that I do when it comes to setting saws. Now, I know back in the day, before a lot of these sort of saw sets that make the job so much easier were available, that an old nail or a screw and a hammer was used into some softwood, or you can actually buy a little tool that you sit on there and you just flex it. I think it's called a set pliers or something like that. I have no experience with those. If that's something that you would like to see, I can try and work out how to set without using a saw set, and then put a video together for you, for those of you that are unable to find these saw sets, because the Somac one, I believe, is the only one that's still in manufacturing today. And so I struggled to actually get a hold of this one, but I did find it. There are plenty of vintage ones out there around the place, but being here in Australia, they're not the easiest to get here, but I'm sure in the States and probably in the UK they're much easier to get a hold of. So do sound off in the comments below how available it is for you to get these, so we can share it with everyone so they might know where to look to actually pick up a decent saw set like this. So if you like this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. While you're down there, sound off in the comments. Is there anything that I've missed here? Is there something you need a little more clarification on when it comes to set? Is there something else you'd like me to show you with set? I would like to know. I've tried to cover everything that I know, but if there is something I've missed, please leave it down below and we can try and cover it in a follow-up video. And if you'd like to see another great video such as this one related to the Spear & Jackson beginner saw set, do check out the video up here where I show you how I reprofile the handles of these saws to make them fit your hand and be more comfortable for you. Bye for now.